ready. Go ahead.
Yeah, you all can hear me okay? Great. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm here to introduce Dr. Amy McGovern. She's visiting us from the University of Oklahoma. And she's a professor at the School of Meteorology and the School of Computer Science, which I learned today she primarily has been teaching in the computer science department and has a large involvement with the meteorology department as well. She's the director of, now let me make sure I get this right, the NSF AI Institute for Research on Trustworthy AI in Weather, Climate, and Coastal Oceanography. Her research focus is applications to severe weather and the ethics of AI, which we'll be speaking about today. She received her PhD in computer science at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And she works a lot across the interface of scientists, forecasters, emergency managers, social scientists, and more. So we're looking forward to hearing your talk today. And just a few things, I'll be keeping an eye on chat along with Pete. So if you have any clarification questions, we'll jump in. Otherwise, we'll take questions at the end via chat or via the hand raise feature. All right, take it away, Amy.
Thank you. Okay. Okay, I assume you can see everything and we're all good. So she already said, Angela already said who I am. We're going to talk about trustworthy AI, but I decided to, I've given a lot of talks about our NSF AI Institute recently, and I decided to change this around to talk about a focus on going all the way from research to operations. And so before I jump into things, I want to say thank you to all of my research group. And I've got photos of all of them here. Some of them are attending the talk. We're going to talk about the different research that many of them are doing. So, and this will be the time my slides decide not to advance. There we go. Okay, so just sort of an idea of what I want to talk about today. I'm going to give a brief overview of our NSF AI Institute, which is, as Angela pointed out, a mouthful, but we have a short acronym, AI2ES, and then talk about how we're working with end users so that we can understand trust better, and then dive somewhat deeply into a case study on frontal boundaries. And then if we have time, this is where Angela's going to come in and say, nah, you went too long already. I have 3 other case studies that are much quicker. Hopefully we get to them, but I can't guarantee that. Okay, so our NSF AI Institute we have 7 academic institutions. OU is the lead of the academic of the institutions. We also have Texas A&M, Corpus Christi, North Carolina State, Colorado State, University of Albany, University of Washington, and Central Michigan, and Del Mar College. And the goal of what we're doing is that we are going to uniquely benefit humanity by developing novel, physically based, which this would be the moment I sneeze, sorry. Physically based, meaning based in the laws of physics, AI techniques. And we're focused on making sure that they are trustworthy. And I'm going to talk a bit about what that means. In fact, I'm going to focus a lot about it on today, what we're going to say, what it means to be trustworthy. And we want these techniques to improve both prediction and understanding of these environmental hazards, as well as the communication of them. In addition to our academic partners, we have a variety of private industry partners who are all listed down here as well. And we are also working with NCAR and NOAA. And we have a Twitter handle. I admit that we don't tweet as much as we should because it's just me running the Twitter handle, but please feel free to follow us. We do tweet when we're doing things like conferences at AMS. We were tweeting all of our talks, and we have a web page that has a fair amount of information on it. So what is it that the Institute is doing? Well, the first part of our foundational research is a cycle. It's a synergistic cycle. We have the Trustworthy AI, where we're working on creating well, I'll talk about what it means on the next slide, what the Trustworthy AI is. They're working hand in hand with the environmental scientists, and then the environmental scientists are also working with the AI researchers and the risk communication researchers. Those are our social scientists. And that cycle of the 3 of us, the 3 groups of people working together is really key, because it's not just AI people trying to develop something with the atmospheric scientists and saying, we think this is good. We're actually working with our end users and understanding why they might trust something and why they might not trust something. Another key part of what we're doing is in AI2ES is working on broadening participation and workforce development, and that again is a cycle. We really want to increase the diversity in both AI and environmental sciences. So looking at our, and this is intended to be a quick overview, looking at our foundational research in trustworthy AI and machine learning, our 3 main goals are that we want to develop XAI, that is explainable AI methods, and interpretable methods that are aligned with environmental science needs. And what that means is that typically the XAI methods that are developed in like in traditional AI research, they've been developed for tasks like ImageNet, where you're given a face or a picture and a scene, and you're trying to classify that scene. And it's just one picture, one static picture. There's no time, there's no space except for what exists in that picture. And by missing all that spatial and temporal autocorrelation and the fact that there's teleconnections across data in the environmental sciences, the XAI methods that exist right now may not necessarily work all that well. So our goal is to develop them and make sure that they work for the needs of environmental science and atmospheric science. Our second goal is to ensure that everything we're doing is based in the laws of physics, because this helps to increase the trust of the end users that we're looking at, and it will help to hopefully improve the predictions, although that's actually an interesting question we could talk about at the very end. And the final goal and the foundational part of the research is to develop robust AI prediction techniques. And by robust, we mean that when they fail gracefully, and we know under the conditions under which they will fail, and we know the conditions under which they will succeed. And we want to be able to empirically and theoretically validate their performance. And I have two quick pictures over on the side there with some links to some papers for recent work that the Institute has put out. And our use-inspired research, we have two goals for everything we're doing in the use-inspired research. We want to create this trustworthy AI that will provide actionable information to a diverse set of end users and use that information to enhance both our scientific and physical understanding of the basic processes. So we don't just want to improve prediction, we also want to improve our understanding. The 5 areas that we're working in are convective weather, so primarily tornadoes, wind, hail, and other convective hazards. Winter weather, where we're looking at predicting what type of precipitation is falling, for example, differentiating between rain and freezing rain. And then how much precipitation is falling and what we can do to improve the predictions so that we can minimize environmental impact. For example, with the New York State system, this effort's led by Albany, with the New York State system, minimizing the impact of salt, because the less salt you put out, the better for the environment. But if you don't put any salt out, then you have people dying on the roads. The second and third and fourth application areas are tropical cyclones or hurricanes in this part of the world. And there, the main task that we're working on is generating synthetic microwave imagery so that we can improve our understanding of the intensification of the tropical cyclones. And then subseasonal to seasonal prediction, and particularly focusing on the S2S end, focusing on extreme events such as atmospheric rivers and how far out we can predict those atmospheric rivers and understand what the causes of them are. And the 5th application domain is coastal oceanography, which is actually quite large. This effort's led by both North Carolina State and Texas A&M Corpus Christi. And North Carolina State, they're looking at understanding coastal ocean or coastal eddies or eddies in the ocean, particularly in the Gulf of Mexico, and then looking at harmful algal blooms. And in Texas, they're looking at predicting fog in the Bay of Corpus Christi, as well as cold stunnings of turtles, because if you can predict the cold events down there, the turtles are cold-blooded and they get stunned when it gets cold. The third part of that foundational cycle that I talked about is the risk communication. And I said that it was key. It really is key, because we're not just AI researchers working with atmospheric scientists. We're trying to really understand what it means to be trustworthy. And so the way we're doing that is that the social scientists, the risk communication researchers, are studying through interviews the needs of our professional decision makers. And so we have a variety of decision makers from all the agencies that are shown here. And we've done some preliminary interviews where we're focusing in on what it is that means to be trusted, what doesn't. I'm going to show in a couple of slides why they might think that something is more trustworthy than another model. The preliminary, very super high level version is that they've highlighted the need for consistency and understanding of the models. And then the question is, what does that mean in the understanding? We'll talk a little bit about that. Sticking with the foundational research inside the AI Institute, we have added a new thrust since we made all of our diagrams, because we realized that it was really, really important that we need to talk about creating ethical and responsible AI as part of trust. And so we have a paper that is available on arXiv in preprint. It just got accepted last week. It'll be in environmental data science, and I'll update the version that's on preprint on arXiv when that one's out, focusing on the beginning of this work. And so what we're looking at here is just talking about the ways in which AI could go wrong for environmental sciences, because traditionally, you might see some of the stuff in the news about how AI is making decisions for your credit rating, or AI is making decisions on your insurance, or it's doing things like the creating the so-called white Obama problem, where they took a downsampled image of Obama. You may have seen this in the news, and then they put it through a neural net and it output a white guy. people think, oh, well, weather and climate's subjective, so that's just not going to have any problems. And so what we try to focus on in this paper was all the ways in which that's completely not true, so that we can make people aware of the issues. And by being more aware of the issues, we can work to not create these issues again in weather and climate applications. And I have an entire talk about that I'm not planning to do today. That's for a future time. But if you want to ask questions about it, I'm happy to talk about it. Looking at the last part of our cycle of the AI Institute, the workforce development, the broadening, and participation are intertwined. And the goals there, we have 3 specific goals, but they overall come down to, we want to broaden participation in AI and AI for weather, all of environmental sciences, by developing programs for all ages. And the 2 main things that we've done so far, we've implemented one of the first community college AI curriculum. It started last fall. We'll graduate the first cohort this next fall. They get a certificate at the end of it, and then they can transfer that into a partnership with Texas A&M Corpus Christi or anywhere else, or they could use it if they're coming back from work. They could use it to improve what they're doing at work. We've also developed AI curriculum for K through 20, and this is available on our website. I was asked during the student meeting, do we have any curricula? Yes, we do. If you go to ai2es.org and click on education, we have a lot of retraining and learning about AI and AI for environmental sciences available for the university audience. The K through 12 curriculum isn't on there yet, although we are working on developing it. So from there, I want to jump into sort of what we're doing to understand trust. And this is a mixture of part of the work from the AI Institute and part of the work from other things that are going on inside my research group. So in the AI2ES interviews, these are being led by Julie Demuth and Ann Bostrom and Mariana Keynes and Chris Wirtz. They're all part of AI2ES. They were doing some preliminary interviews focused on NWS forecasters. So out of that list of government users that we talked about earlier, these are just focused on forecasters, and asking about their views on 2 AI severe weather products. And they were looking at day-ahead hail prediction, which is something that we've developed in my group, and storm mode prediction, which is something that was developed at NCAR. And in storm mode identification, you're trying to take the radar data and say what storm mode this is. Is it a supercell? Is it a line, et cetera? And so one of the quotes from the pre-tests, and this is looking at the storm mode identification. This is just a quote from one of the forecasters. There was a check with an actual human that's going on, identifying storm mode cells by hand. That output's being incorporated in the learning process. To me, I like that there's checks and balances against the human. I don't personally think we can rely on one piece of guidance without human input yet. We may get there, but this increases my trust in the guidance. So they really like that we were doing hand-in-hand guidance, that it's not just, here's something we threw over the wall and we expect you to use it. We're trying to provide something that's just guidance to the human, and it's helping the human, but it's not simply taking over the human's job. Another set of results from the preliminary interviews. What do you think about the question trustworthiness? What might it mean in the context of the AI machine learning guidance? And then 3 separate answers. Well, if you're saying trustworthiness like a certain product, how does it perform on a consistent basis? No model is ever going to be perfect. And I think that's key, that the meteorology audience understands that models are never going to be perfect. And so you don't expect the AI model to come in and be perfect. They just want to see how well it's going to work and when it works and when it doesn't work. Another forecaster, examples of how it could have improved the forecast, specifically in terms of timing, location, and intensity. So they want to see examples. And then when I think of trustworthy, I think of the guidance being predictable in ways that you know it's not going to work out, so you can make mental adjustments. So they understand when it will work, when it won't work, and they want to be able to adjust it. And we ask them some other questions. What do you think about the term? And then the term is here is on the side, trustworthiness, explainability, interpretability. What does it mean in terms of your guidance? So looking at the term trustworthiness, if it's not perfect, that's okay. But knowing how it performs in certain situations and seeing that and getting that kind of baseline for how it performs, that increases the trust. Then we were asking them, looking at like GUIs and how we could show them the understanding of the model, the XAI. So the explainability. Well, if we boil it down to say, here's the basic conceptual model, we got to go down that route to make sure we don't overcomplicate the AI to where it's not usable. So they want to see as much of the conceptual model as they can so they can understand what it's doing internally. And then finally asking about interpretability of the model and interpretability of how the data is being displayed. And here the response from the forecaster is, how the data is displayed is critical. I get frustrated when really, really good tools are hard to use for various reasons. It needs to have an intuitive and useful way of displaying the data. You know, some of this may not be things that you thought of when you were thinking about how to make my AI method. Particularly AI researchers tend to think if it's objectively validated, then it should just be trusted. And that isn't necessarily the case. We really need to work with our forecasters to understand, and our end users in general, to understand what their needs are and what kinds of data that they want to see and how they want to see the model. So looking at another set of ways of looking at the question of whether you should use the machine learning in an operational environment, because I said I was going to talk about research all the way to operations. David Harrison, who's a PhD student of mine who works for SPC, gave a talk at AMS about developing machine learning for an operational environment, and I grabbed like 3 of his slides. So you want to see his whole talk, go to the AMS webpage because they're all archived and online. I'm just going to give you a short preview. And that is, he worked inside the hazardous weather test bed, which I think many of you are familiar with, but if you're not, it's hosted by the SPC and the NSSL. In 2020 and 2021, it was online, so completely virtual. This picture is from before we all had to wear masks. They had 133 participants last year, and he did a survey of these participants, and they came from all of the different offices that are listed here, some of whom I'm sure came from you all. He had a huge response to his survey. And many, you can see where they came from: operational forecasters, academic faculty and staff, students, and researchers. And then he asked them how familiar they were with machine learning. And in general, they were somewhat knowledgeable. They were not super experts. Nobody answered that, but they were somewhat knowledgeable. And then he asked them, and this is where I'm cutting down the slides. If you go to his talk, he has a whole bunch of questions, and I just cut down to just this question. You're told that a new probabilistic forecast model is the result of a machine learning model. How important are each of the following factors in determining how useful the new product might be to your personal forecasting process? And the order in which they answer this, and he compared this for when it was machine learning versus when it wasn't machine learning. And I'm not going to do that today in the nature of time, but the order in which they answered what was most important is pretty interesting. And we have the density of their answers too. This was a Likert scale, so they did from 1 to 5, most important to less important, and you can see the spread of the responses here. And the most important thing that they wanted to see was knowledge of the limitations and the possible failure conditions, which is something that you often don't see when you're just doing traditional AI research. They also want to see verification of the product, and then third, timeliness and availability of the product. And I'm not going to talk about all the rest of the answers, but that timeliness and availability really matters. If you've got an AI method that you've developed, but it takes so long that it's not available in real time, it's not going to be useful for your forecaster. So you really do need to think about how you're developing your method and how efficient it is. And just a couple other quotes. I'm not going to go through these in detail, but talking about the collaboration during the development process is really, really critical. That means we're talking to our end users all the way through. That came from a forecaster. Then the researchers or forecaster said, well, some exploratory and visionary work could be done without the forecasters, but you need to be involving the forecasters all the way through the development and testing. And so it's emphasizing the same point. And then the third one said, early interaction with the forecasters is extremely important. It offers insight to where we need the forecast guidance and the type of information that might be beneficial. And so David summarized his findings in all of this with that we need to communicate with our end users early and often if we want to make sure that our AI is actually used. We make sure that things are timely, and that means that we're using good coding practices. I think that's not always the case. Sometimes when we're making research code, we're like, it took an hour to make a forecast. Well, if you're trying to do something in real time, an hour is not going to work. Focus on the individual cases as much as the bulk statistics. Many people like to look at the objective verification without looking at the individual cases. Those individual cases really, really matter. Make sure you're consulting with the domain experts, and then make sure that you give your end users plenty of time to test and experiment with your prototypes, and you have to go into it without an ego and realize that they're going to find ways to break your prototype, and they're going to find ways to make your prototype lots better. So I think my timer says I have plenty of time to dive into our case study. The case study that I'm going to talk about also was discussed at AMS, but I'm going to do some additional slides as well. So this is led by an undergraduate at OU, Andrew Justin. I know he's on the call. Here we are working on operational real-time identification of frontal boundaries across all of CONUS plus the oceans using a 3D deep learning model. And so the idea here, I mean, I traditionally, when I give talks, I'm talking about severe weather. The idea here is actually motivated by a problem that we were approached by WPC and OPC about this, that they have to create surface analyses by hand. WPC does them every 3 hours, OPC does them every 6 hours, and they're doing them over a huge domain. It's not just the CONUS that's shown here. I'll show you the full domain in a minute. And it's very labor intensive. And when they're doing that every 3 hours, it takes a lot of their time. And our goal is to develop a first guess system that reduces the time that's needed so that they can spend time on other tasks or spend time perfecting what they're doing. We had preliminary work from a former PhD student of mine that demonstrated scale at doing cold front, warm fronts. And we're changing the model to use what's called a UNet, which is an image-to-image translation system, and I'll show you a picture of it in a minute. The domain that we're working on the left here is just showing the domain over the CONUS, and that's where we trained on. We have data over the entire this entire colored area, so it's basically all the Pacific all the way over to the Atlantic Ocean. And that person who's sitting in the waiting room is a student of mine. I know you all are trying to let in only people you know. We go all the way from the Pacific to the Atlantic, and we're because that's the full domain that they're trying to do every 6 hours. So the domain over the US is where they're doing every 3 hours. This is the every 6 hours, and it's a huge domain to be identifying warm front, cold front, stationary fronts, and occluded fronts over. Some interesting challenges of this data. The data is provided, as I said, WPC labels every 3 hours, OPC labels every 6, and TAFB, which is the Tropical Analysis Forecast Branch, labels every 6. The data is all hand-drawn by the forecasters, and it causes some very interesting, I'm not going to say problems, but when you're trying to train on data that you call truth, you want that truth to pretty much be self-agreeing. What we did here, we graphed the cold front frequency from 2008 to 2020, which is the domain that we have data for. And what you can see in this graph is that there's a very, very clear delineation of boundaries. So first of all, you can see that CONUS boundary where WPC is forecasting every 3 hours very clearly, right? Because the frequencies just drop off in the line. This is just a frequency plot. It doesn't show office boundaries, and yet the office boundaries show up. You can also see the TAFB office boundary, which is down here. And then Honolulu has a boundary right there, which you might have to look at a little bit more closely, but it is right there. That's where Honolulu draws. The other thing you can see is that so these fronts, if you were trying to train your machine learning data on this, and you were trying to train over this whole domain and a front simply stopped, you're telling your machine learning that the front is not existing over there. And that's not true. This is why we ended up training over the smaller domain and then applying to the larger domain, although we are working on trying to extend the training out to the larger domain. The other thing that's interesting is as we've been interviewing our forecasters, we've discovered that not everybody agrees about exactly where the front is and what a front is, particularly for the occluded and the stationary fronts. Warm fronts and cold fronts are a little bit more agreed upon. But you might have what one forecaster might draw as an occluded front might show up as a warm front to another forecaster, which makes it also interesting for our data. So what our input data looks like, we have the cold front, warm front, stationary and occluded front. They're colored on this diagram according to the axis down here. When we go to train it, we discovered that it was really, really hard to train. Basically, we're doing 25-kilometer resolution, and it was really hard to train to a just basically infinitesimal thin line. It was just one grid point wide. So we made it a 25 kilometers wider on either side. So they're now 75-kilometer boundaries. It's a lot easier to train the machine learning model on this. So that's the first step. The data that we're using is ERA5, quarter degree data every 3 hours. We have data from 2008 to 2020. And we have 60 different variables that we're using. It's mostly the 12 variables at the different heights that are shown on this table. And then we're exploring using ablation studies, because if we come back to that timeliness product right now, this is a lot of data that you would want to throw 60 variables through to do this in real time might not be feasible. The data is all normalized, so min-max normalization. But if you're really, really curious what data we used, it's all in this table. The approach that we used is a 3-dimensional UNet. And then it's a unit. So there's if you've read deep learning literature at all, there's a UNet plus plus, and a UNet 3+. And I'm not going to explain all the differences between them, but a UNet basically takes in, as a whole, all 3 kinds of UNets take in an image and output an image. In our case, we give it those 60 different variables that we just showed on the previous slide, and we output the probability of the fronts at each height level. The UNet 3+ is a improvement on the original UNet by allowing it to learn some higher resolution features with not as many features as the UNet++. The UNet++ was trying to improve the resolution of the UNet, but it added too many parameters. So this is just a diagram of what it's doing. And then the 3-dimensional structure that we're doing is we take that data, because you remember we have different height levels, and we're doing 2 different kinds of convolutional kernels and comparing them 3 by 3 by 3 and 5 by 5 by 5 to see how much data there is that matters. And we train 3 different models: cold front, warm front, stationary occluded, and just any front versus no front. We trained on 2008 to 2016, validated on 2017 to 2018, and testing on 2019 to 2020. And the loss function we're using is fraction skill score, which I actually showed 10 slides ago. And the cool thing on a fraction skill score, if you're not familiar with it, I'm not going to flip back on the slides because then it'll take me forever to get back to this one. It lets you basically look at the shape of the object within a window. So that if you're getting the front right, but you're off by 1 pixel, you're not getting penalized. If you're getting the front right and you're off by enough, then you are getting penalized, because that means you're not really finding the front. And so as long as you're staying within a small window, you're still saying you're finding that front. And that's the way we're training. This is an image of just a cold front, warm front. So the human labeled fronts are the dark ones. And then the shaded probabilities are the machine learning ones. And this is just a case study from a particular day where it works pretty well. You can see, this cold front, the machine learning identified it further south. This cold front, it goes farther out. And they're not always on top of each other, but they're very close to each other in the vast majority of the cases. We look at the objective verification before we wanted to test it with actual human forecasters and figure out how well it was really working. And we compared, I could have spammed you with objective verification model pictures because we have about 20 of them, and I decided that one slide was sufficient. Comparing just the 3x3 kernel and the 5x5 kernel on the cold front, warm front, and front, no front. And it is always the case that 5x5 outperforms the 3x3x3. And so we're going to stick with that for our what we tested with the humans. And cold fronts and warm fronts did better. Cold fronts do the best overall. Cold fronts are the easiest to find, probably because they're the most numerous in our data, and they are the most clearly defined. Okay, so moving to sort of how we can do this with forecasters, we developed, David Harrison already, whose work I talked about earlier, David Harrison had a graphical interface for some of his other work. And so we were able to put our cold front, warm front, occluded front, stationary front prediction system into his interface. And this is just a screenshot. I thought about doing a live demo and decided that was way too risky. But this is a screenshot from his interface of what the forecasters can then go in and see, and then they can turn on the different layers. They can look at their ERA5 data, they can look at the temperature and the wind and the surface obs, and they can decide whether or not our system worked well versus with the machine, did the machine learning, how did it compare to the human done fronts? So in this case, the dark things are the human fronts again, and then the probability contours are the machine learning fronts. This is where I thought, well, maybe it would be fun to do a live demo, but I have to admit, after having done a live demo where I flew a drone at AMS, I'm not quite that brave to do a live demo where the internet may or may not decide to behave today. So just going to tell you what happened. We interviewed 9 forecasters spread across WPC, OPC, and TAFB. The interviews just ended last week, so I don't have quotes. I don't have anything other than initial results, but I wanted to talk about those initial results because I think they're really interesting. We didn't expect this one. All 9 forecasters said right up front when we asked them after they'd done what they did is they went through a bunch of case studies. We asked them questions about the case study, how well the machine learning agreed, how well with what the humans did, would they have changed their output, all of these things. They all said they would incorporate the model into their workflow. They really liked it. They thought that it would improve what they're doing. But universally, they also didn't like it on the web. They all wanted to be inside the tool that they're using, which is part of creating the Trustworthy AI. They're using NAWIPS, which is a system that's getting ready to go away. But if you are acquainted at all with the operational community, going away real soon now. It could be any time in the next 2 to 10 years is what I gather from talking to everybody. So we're going to work on incorporating it into NAWIPS. And eventually it's going to go into AWIPS. They all preferred, this was another interesting finding, all 9 of them preferred having the fronts said to be cold front, warm front, occluded front, and stationary front over the model that just said front, no front. They wanted to see what kind of front we were predicting. Every single one of them preferred probabilistic guidance over deterministic guidance. They currently have a front prediction system inside their NAWIPS, but it's deterministic, and apparently they love seeing the probabilities. They would talk about the probabilities in their interview. And then consistent with the other guidance that I talked about earlier, they wanted to see case studies. We had provided about 10 different case studies, but they said, oh no, this is exactly where something struggles. I want to see this case study. And in fact, one of them has requested a very specific case study from a couple of weeks ago, but we have to wait for ERA5 to release that data. And then the other thing we learned is that the human data is not infallible. And sometimes the different offices don't agree with each other. And then the other thing we learned is that sometimes when they were looking at areas of disagreement between machine learning and the forecasters, like I showed you in the case study, the forecasters often said they preferred the machine learning answer. And that didn't mean that they were necessarily dissing their fellow forecasters. The issue is that when they're doing these forecasts in real time, they're under tremendous time pressure. And so that's why they really wanted to see this model. They wanted to see what the machine learning said. They said that it was good enough that they would start with the machine learning answer and then see where they needed to adjust it. And that would give them more time to refine their answers. I think I talk fast because I have time to do the other case studies, so that's good. I wanted to dive deeper into that one because it's one that we're taking all the way from the foundational research of trying to make the AI method all the way to working with the forecasters and figure out how we can actually put it into operations. And since that one's funded by NOAA Jetty rather than NSF, we actually have the funding to put it into operations, hopefully in the next year or so. The other stuff that we're doing with AI2ES is all funded for the foundational research and understanding the trust. And then we work on trying to find the NOAA funding if we want to put it into operations. So looking at some more, another couple of quick case studies. Looking at hail forecasting in particular, we were looking at hail forecasting in two different ways. We've tested in many years in HWT, probably 2015, I think, onward. We've been testing a day of hail forecasting product. So it's trying to mimic the SPC forecast. So looking at 24 to 48 hours in advance specifically. And we refine the product every year based on forecaster feedback. The base model is just a random forest, and it post-processes the CAM output. So one of the interesting findings, I decided not to dive into this model. I just wanted to talk about the trust end because that was what I wanted to focus in on this talk. The first year that we were looking at a new model, we had changed the model up, was 2018. Time has sort of blended together with the pandemic. We had a model that was very reliable, but it was predicting far too hot according to the SPC forecaster needs. So SPC puts out very low probabilities. They almost never put out a 60% probability, although they can. They never put anything above 60%. When it's kind of a high day, they're putting out 45s. On this particular day, they're putting out 5 and 15s. And our model, if you look into the middle of the model there, is putting out 80%. Now, we plotted on here the verification. So that's actually where it actually hailed. And you can see that our model verified really, really well. Sure, it missed a few things up here, low probability events, but it verified really well, especially in that 80% region. But the learning about the needs of the forecasters is really, really important because the SPC forecasters didn't want to use our model because they said it was just flat out too hot. So the next year, since you can only test one model in a year, so that was 2018, 2019, we took the exact same model and recalibrated the probabilities to match. And we tried a couple of different probability calibrations to see what the forecasters thought about it. And they really liked it. So it said it scored slightly higher than the HREF guidance, and they expressed interest in seeing these products over more seasons. So they wanted to see it in more detail. So we decided, well, let's see if we can improve this even further. And one of the things we did was we looked at, can we change our model up so that we take our understanding of the physics of the way that hail works? Hail production isn't uniform across the whole CONUS. Hail production differs by season. That's what I'm showing over here is the climatology from SPC. It differs by season, it differs by region. And our training data is very, very limited, especially because the Weather Service keeps changing the underlying model out from underneath us and not retrospectively regenerating that data. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with this problem. So we have to just wait for time to happen to gather more training data. So a way that we can improve on this is to weight our training data. And so our question was, could we weight our training data and improve the model by creating regional models that would improve trust? And what we did was we weighted it by the main 4 months of the year where you generate hail. So you looked at weighting it more heavily if it was May hail, June hail, July hail, and August hail. And you can see based on the graphs here, so the color of the dot and the size of the dot is the higher the weight. So all of the models trained on all of the data. If you look carefully, all of the data is present in every single one of these. But the weight for the training examples was higher if it was closer to that month. So we trained a May model, a June model, a July model, and an August model. And what's interesting, just by weighting by time, you end up very, very close to the climatology from Centennial et al. And this is just a radar observed climatology. If you flip back and forth between those two, the data that we had, they are very similar to each other. And how well did this work? So we tested this in 2020, which was the first year that it was the virtual model. And we got a tweet that we liked. We could grab the screenshot because we liked it because Adam Clark of SPC said this was going to be a game changer. He said that storm proxies are useful, but AI could be a game changer. He really liked the model that year. We're continuing to refine the model. We're continuing to look into whether or not we're going to do deep learning with this model. We're testing a deep learning approach probably this year and then another deep learning approach next year. But I think that, looking and making sure that we're continuing to take those forecaster needs into account is how we're improving the trust so that the model can get used. So another model that we're working on developing is a nowcasting model for hail. And I only have one slide on this, but this is done with REU students this last summer, Lydia Spichala and Jordan Robinson, and then a whole bunch of people from AI2ES. And here we're looking at whether or not we can train a UNet to forecast hail in the next hour. So our goal, our longer term goal, is to be able to do this globally, in fact. But for the scale of doing an REU project, we just took in the HER model. We were outputting mesh data, so the maximum expected size of hail, and trying to see whether or not we could, given HER data, improve upon the bias of the data so that we could do a better nowcasting 0 to 1 hour. The long-term goal is that we want to incorporate observations into this. So can we use lightning? Can we use satellite data? And can we do it globally? We'd really like to not just look at the United States, but look at Australia and South America and Europe, although it doesn't hail as much in Europe, but it certainly does. And one of the things that happens in other places outside the United States is the hail actually kills people sometimes. And so we would really like to improve the nowcasting on a global scale if we can. What's shown on this slide is a case study for the hail that destroyed, well, my roof, along with a lot of the town in Norman last year. So this was the April 2021 hailstorm. And this is the truth data of it. The storm reports, a lot of it, there should be storm reports all over town, quite frankly. But the machine learning was able to localize that much better than what HER did. HER came out with a giant swath. And for the severe hail and the SIG severe hail, the machine learning was able to localize it. Another model that we're looking at is working on tornado nowcasting as well. And so for this one, trying to train a machine learning model to improve the tornado nowcasting from both radar and observational data. And the idea that we're trying out here, and I only have one slide on this because it's a really interesting idea and we don't have any results yet, but train the model that's trained on radar data. So we're training it on GridRAD radar data right now, and then run it on Warn on forecast data, their simulated reflectivity, and see if in real time what we trained on GridRAD will work for predicting tornadoes well in WAFs. We don't know how well this is going to work. It might be a complete failure, but it might be really interesting as well. It might work well. It's a way to provide improvement over WAFs because the biases that are already in WAFs, we don't have enough WAFs data to really create the machine learning model in the first place just straight up from WAFs, whereas we can have lots and lots of years of archives of the radar data. And my final case study is looking at, because I promised all of these in the abstracts, looking at winter precipitation type classification. This is work that David Harrison did. And here he was working on creating a UNet, or not a UNet, a 1D CNN to just classify whether or not something was sleet, freezing rain, mixture, snow, rain, etc. And he started out by trying to just flat out classify the class labels, like, is it snow, is it freezing rain, is it sleet? And he's using the data to train that he's using as MPing, which is the meteorological phenomenon identification near the ground. It's data that's collected from humans. And it turns out that there's a lot of, especially in the rain, freezing rain, sleet, there's a lot of disagreement among the data. And so he ended up training to a mixture, so where you could predict, rather than just predicting this is all snow, this is all freezing rain, et cetera, predicting the probabilities of what would happen and being able to predict those mixtures. And then he put it into a real-time system where it can actually take the radar data in and predict what is actually happening in real time. And it worked really, really well. If you're used to looking at performance diagrams, you want to be up in this upper right-hand corner. And all the precipitation types, except for just straight up frozen rain, did really, really well. Straight up frozen rain is just hard to predict. I think I'm going to hit my 40-minute mark. So what I want to end on is just saying that AI for weather is really, really transformational. We're making transformational improvements across a wide variety of applications in weather climate. I didn't talk about coastal oceanography because it's not my specialty, but it is certainly something that AI2ES is working on. I have a grand vision that I want to create a multi-agency, multi-sector, transdisciplinary center that will help improve climate resiliency, because we all know the climate is changing. And I don't want to, I got asked this question in a student meeting when I was talking about this vision. I'm not necessarily thinking about policy. I'm thinking about how we can use AI to improve our fundamental understanding of the weather and the climate so that we can improve our resiliency as the climate is changing. I think that it is really, really critical that we also work on the policy aspect, but that wasn't something I was traditionally thinking about. More thinking about how we can get the research all the way into operations so that we can actually enable people at all levels to make better decisions as the climate is changing. This really should be a multi-agency effort because it's not just NSF that's interested in it, not just NOAA, all the agencies should be interested in it. It should involve our international partnerships, and it needs to involve not just AI and atmospheric science researchers, but social scientists as well, because hopefully both focusing on the trust that I've been talking about, I've shown you how much the social science aspect really, really matters. And I think that is my ending, which is right on time, according to my timer.
Thanks a lot, Amy. I don't know, everyone puts their hand emojis on the screen. I'd like to invite the students to ask a student to ask their question first. I'm going to give everyone a little bit of time to either put their question in the chat or raise their hand, but I'd like it first to at least call on a student. So I'll give you all a chance to collect your thoughts. Either raise your hand or put the question in chat.
You have one hand up. I don't know who's students and who's not, but you do have a hand up.
Oh, I see Zoe. Zoe, go ahead.
I'm a student. Great talk, Amy. One curiosity I had was from the social science research and responses from forecasters, how did opinions vary by their age or time from their degree? Kind of people who are more historically using
That's an excellent
more
question.
hand analysis.
That is an excellent question. I don't have the answer to that for the data that the AI2ES collected because I'm not in their IRB, so I don't directly observe their interviews. I only get to see what they put out. But I can tell you an answer for that for the forecasters because I'm the one who's running the interviews for the 9 forecasters that we interviewed, and there was definitely a difference in familiarity with AI. There was definitely a difference in comfort with AI, but every single one of them said that they were willing to use it, whether or not they understood the AI well. And I think that was pretty interesting. There was actually one forecaster who was, I don't want to out our forecasters. There was one forecaster who'd been doing more hand analysis for a lot longer time than the other forecasters. Let's go with that. And even though that particular forecaster was not very familiar with AI at all, very much liked the product. I think that's probably going to be true for the AI2ES interviews, but I don't want to speculate since I don't get to see their data of who all they're interviewing. If you're familiar with IRB, you have to be in the IRB protocol to get the names and everything. That answer that?
Yeah, thank you.
I actually thought it was a surprising result, honestly. I thought that the results would be that the longer the forecasters have been doing it by hand, the less they would want to change.
All right, we'll open up to everyone for questions. I'll either look for your hand raised or questions in the chat.
Everybody's quiet.
It sometimes takes a little bit to type it up. I guess while everyone's typing or thinking of their question, I was wondering if you could, oh, I got one from Sarah. Go ahead, Sarah.
Hi, Amy. Were you surprised when you found out that a lot of the forecasters like the probabilistic fronts as opposed to the deterministics?
A little bit. Going into it, I kind of expected they were going to want the deterministic fronts, but it was universal that they all wanted the probabilistic, and they really like seeing where it was super confident that there was a front, and then they like seeing where it was unconfident. So yeah, I was a little bit surprised.
We have a question in the chat from Nuo. Is it necessary to retrain the model every year or so, considering the possibility of the shifting climatology?
Yes, I think it probably is. It depends on, I'm going to say that in general. You didn't even say which model, they didn't say which model it is. I am going to say that yes, I think that it is necessary to retrain pretty much every model because the hail climatology is shifting, the tornado climatology is shifting, a lot of the climatologies are shifting, and I think that it's important. Also, I think we get more data every year, and the more data we have, the better we do. I don't know if that'll be the case for the fronts, because I don't think the fronts are using the climatology so much, but it's also not that hard to retrain. So if you had to retrain your model once a year, it's not the end of the world. For the hail forecast, I see the question in the chat. Do you want me to read them out loud, or you want me to?
Sure, Amy. Yeah, could you read them out loud?
Yeah,
Or I can
great
do it
talk
for
for
you.
either way. For the hail forecast, I was wondering if it also predicts the hail size. The day ahead hail model is predicting the size, and as actually both of them are. Both the nowcasting and the day ahead model are predicting the size. The way we did that for both of them is almost the same. For the day ahead model, which we've done for years, we had trained two different random forests. One predicts hail, no hail, and then inside the area where it's a hail zone or predicted to be hail, we actually predict the hail. We predict, because we're predicting mesh, we predict the distribution of the hail, and the way we're doing that is trying to predict the size and the shape parameters for the gamma distribution, so that you can actually predict something that looks like mesh. For the deep learning model, which is the nowcasting approach, we did the same thing. We trained a classification approach. So we had two RU students. So one RU student trained hail, no hail, and the other RU student was training on the zone where you're predicting hail, you're predicting what size. That one was just a direct regression model. We weren't predicting shape and size distribution. We were just flat out predicting the size of the hail. But in both cases, I think it's really important to predict the hail size. In both cases, you have to be careful. The reason that we're doing it the way we're doing it is that because hail is a rare event, if you try to predict something, if you try to train a model that's just predicting size, and you try to do that over, say, the whole CONUS, it's mostly going to predict zeros. So by training the model that's only predicting what size it is, given that it's going to hail, then you have a lot more data going into it, so you can get a more reliable forecast out of it. Because you know that the large hailstorms, like the one that destroyed my roof, are already rare, even though I am on roof 4 in 17 years. They're still rare.
A follow-on question on Amy, using MPing. How do you get a pretty good sample of null cases where, you know, for example, it's not hail or not a type of precip, and how does that affect the training if, you know, the question of null cases?
For MPing, not so great. There's not as much of a null sample. For the other data, we pretty much make sure we put enough null cases in there, right? So we're sampling across like for mesh, you just sample enough. And honestly, if you're sampling randomly for the deep learning, you're going to sample mostly null, right? So we throw out a bunch of null so that we can end up with a more balanced data set. For the MPing, we have to be very deliberate about how we're sampling so that because you don't get as much null. In some current work, we're working with somebody who's been working on combining MPing and ASOS together to get a more consistent data set. One of the things that happens in MPing that I didn't realize till he gave the talk last week is that the MPing users go to sleep.
What?
So yeah, exactly. But if you're relying on human data, they go to sleep. So right, then the events stop happening overnight. So having the automated system is important too.
Makes sense. Do you see the question?
I do, and it actually leads into that question. So I briefly mentioned AI can perpetuate environmental injustices. Can I expand on this? Yes. And as it turns out, anything that human provided, that data comes in from the humans, there's already tends to be a bias too. So something simple like the humans just go to sleep. Something simple like if I was using hail report, storm report data for the hail and not mesh, it would find out, and I have slides on this, but no time to go grab them. You would find out that it only hails where people are. And so if you were training a model to predict hail and you only had hail reports from where the people were, you might miss all the hail that's out in the rural areas. So that would be an injustice. Another example that I have a really nice graphic from that comes from Jack Sillen on Twitter, not my graphic at all, I totally credit him. He shows a graphic of where the low level coverage of the NexRad radars is compared to the population of the black counties in the Southeast United States. And I don't think in any regard that the National Weather Service was placing these radars to be in any way racist. But where they placed the radars, they missed a bunch of counties that are heavily black. Now, imagine you're training a tornado model on only radar data, and it requires really good low-level coverage. Now you have trained a model that might have improved things for where there's low-level coverage, but you have a whole bunch of counties that don't have low-level coverage, which are heavily black. And so now you're perpetuating an injustice in the sense that you're not going to be predicting tornadoes in those counties, especially if you just automated it, for example. So those are some examples. I can talk about more, but those are the ones that are easy to explain right off the top of my head without any graphics.
And Amy, is that covered a bit more in the recent publication that you had talked about?
Yes.
Okay, great. A question from Ian McConnell. How much did your front prediction model reflect biases of meteorologists versus physical reality?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. I think that okay. I will have a better in-depth answer to that at the end of the semester, because the two undergrads who have been working on that project for their capstone project are doing hand analysis and then comparing it to the forecaster hand analysis and comparing it to the machine learning. So they're going to do an in-depth version of that. But what I have from the interviews is that when we diverged the machine learning model from what the forecasters had done during their time pressured version, typically the forecasters said they preferred our version. And so typically, and not always, every once in a while they'd say, well, I think I probably would have drawn it back here. But most of the time they preferred the machine learning model. How that reflects physical reality and what happened in real time, it isn't necessarily to say that the machine learning or that the real-time forecasters were doing a bad job. They don't have the reanalysis data that we're using, right? They're using real-time OBS. So there might have been noise in the OBS, and they might have had a reason that they drew the front 100 kilometers away from where we drew the front, right? And so I don't know that, I'm not trying to claim that we're solving the biases is what I'm trying to say. I'm saying that in retrospect, when they looked at our data, they liked our data better. Does that help answer the question? Feel free to throw back in the chat or unmute and see. Okay.
All right, question from Kevin. A lot of forecasting products, especially for severe weather, are latency sensitive. Did you run into issues with your ML models being able to provide their predictions in a reasonable amount of time for the forecasters to use them?
That is an excellent question. And that's what I talked about with the timeliness. I agree with that. We have not fielded the fronts model in real time yet. We have it available on a web interface, but it's all post hoc, right? Because we don't have the ERA5 data in real time, so it didn't really matter. For the hail stuff we've optimized to make sure that it's running the day ahead hail predictions, that they're running quickly enough that they're available. And in the SPC, they only do those every so many hours, so it's okay. For the nowcasting product, that's going to be a key focus before we field it inside HWT. We're not ready to do our nowcasting hail or nowcasting tornado products inside HWT yet, but when we do, we're going to make sure that it's running very quickly. I want it to be running within a 15-minute cycle, but it's not yet ready. So I don't have an answer to that, but I do know in the past, I was doing a random forest-based storm mode prediction inside HWT 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. And our best model wasn't the one we were able to field because we were only able to run it so quickly. And so I had to scale back. In particular, I had to go back to, I think, 100 trees rather than 250 or 500 trees, even though those were better models, because we had to be able to get it. That one had to run over every storm. It was actually using Prob Severe data. It had to run over every single storm that Prob Severe identified within a 2-minute cycle, because Prob Severe was identifying new storms every 2 minutes. And so we had to just scale back to a really fast model. It wasn't quite as accurate to run it.
Question from Noah. Much like the radar problem in the rural US, how might you apply machine learning weather prediction in data sparse areas like in the Southern Hemisphere?
It's something I very much want to do. I don't have an answer to that. For the hail problem, we're going to try to work on predicting it in Australia and South America. And it's a really interesting question how well it's going to work down there, because it is very much data sparse. We don't have the verification data. Even in Europe, they don't have a consistent mesh product and a verification set for the hail data. But we want to make the way that I'm viewing it for the environmental justice method is that we're trying to make sure we're aware of the sparsity of the data so that whatever we develop doesn't work in only one area. So even though we're doing something over CONUS right now where there's not as much data sparseness, we're trying to make sure that whatever we develop will work with the other kinds of radar or the model data that's available in the other areas. I don't have an answer to how well it's going to work. Ask me that in about a year and a half. I hope we'll have some results for some of these places. We're just spinning those projects up.
Any other questions?
If you think of anything else, I'm happy to answer email, tweets, whatever. I'm on Twitter too much.
Well, thanks for taking the time to do this, Amy. It was really fantastic. And
thank you.
Yep. Thanks, everybody. Another round of applause. Thanks.